In this video, let's try to understand what is nginx. Nginx is a software which can be used for web serving, load balancing, and content caching. This doesn't mean that it can be used only for these three things. There are multiple things which nginx does, but these are the most popular things which nginx do. So let's start with the first one, web serving. Web server. Let's try to understand web server with an example of a restaurant. In a restaurant, there would be a waiter. The waiter doesn't cook the food for us. Rather, the waiter takes the order from us, goes to the chef, and get back to us with the food. That is what a web server does. It takes the request from the browser and get back to browser with the web page. So let us assume that whenever a user hits a particular URL, something like this, index.html, we want an HTML page to be rendered to the browser, maybe from some physical location. Now, how can we make this happen? Let's just introduce a web server and configure it saying that whenever index.html is hit, pick up a HTML file from the particular physical location and serve it to the browser. Here a static content is served to the browser. Similarly, we can serve a dynamic content also. Now talking about another use case of web server, this is called as proxy server. So what is proxy server? Let's assume we have another server where our application is running and we don't want that server to be exposed to the external network. So whenever a user makes a request, it should first hit the web server, that is the proxy server, and from the proxy server, it would be passed to our server. So there is no direct contact with the external network. So this is something called proxy server. Next, let's try to understand what is load balancer. Let's assume that you have recently developed an application and it started facing a lot of traffic. You cannot manage it in a single server. So you decide to host your application in 4 different servers. Now, how do you expect your user to access your application? One is like you can give 4 different addresses to these 4 instances and ask your user to enter the first address and see if it is working. If it doesn't work, then you will ask your user to enter the second address. If that doesn't work, then the third address. This is a possible solution, but doesn't seem to be logical, isn't it? So what do we want? We want something in between which would do this work, like which would decide which server has to serve it. The user would always enter a single address, and based on the address or based on the configuration, this middleman or the middle software would decide which server has to serve it. So such software is known as load balancer. Now the last one is content caching. What is caching? Usually whenever a user enters a URL, the web server makes a request to that application server and gets the response from that application server and fetch it to the browser. But what if the same URL is hit again? The whole process repeats. But do we really need the overhead of going back to that application server and getting the response when we already know the response? What if we store the response for the request somewhere in the web server and fetch it directly from the server next time when the same URL is hit? This is known as caching. When you store the response for the request in some physical location and fetch it directly from that location when the same request is made again. And nginx can be configured for caching by adding these configurations. Since we are done with discussing the 3 most popular use cases of nginx, let me just quickly show you the configuration file of nginx, which you can alter as per your requirement. Since I'm using the Windows machine, I would spin up a Linux container with nginx in it. Because nginx is something which is used for best suited for Linux. We can use nginx in Windows, but usually Microsoft IS is most preferred in the Windows machine. Now, since my container is up and running, let's just navigate to the location where the nginx configuration exists. Now let's just see what is there inside this folder. Here you can see the configuration in 2 different locations. One is this nginx.conf, another one is conf.d. So nginx.conf would have a higher level of configuration which would be applicable across all the hosted application. Now if you want to override or add some extra configuration, you can add the configuration file in this conf.d folder. By default, a file named default.conf would already be available in this conf.d folder. So now let's just see what is there inside the nginx.conf file. Here, as I said, you would see all the higher level of configuration. Maybe something which is interesting is, for the example, this log format, where you just define a format and assign a name. Now this name can be used across all the configuration and you don't have to define it again. Now let's just navigate to the conf.d folder. And let's see what is there inside this. As I said, there is only a single file named default.conf existing. So let's just see what is there inside that file. Default.conf would have the configuration which we discussed in our previous slide. I think on seeing this piece of code, you would be able to recognize or remember what we discussed, where you configure the server to fetch the index.html file from a physical path. S- Similarly, you can configure this nginx server as a proxy server as well as for caching also. You just have to add the corresponding configuration over here. Before concluding this video, I would like to talk about certain misconceptions about nginx. Are Nginx and Apache the only two web server available? No, definitely not. There are several other web server available, such as Tomcat, IES, etc. But these are the two most popular ones. Can Nginx be configured as Nginx Ingress controller? No, definitely not. Nginx Ingress controller is an ingress controller made for Nginx. If you would like to know more about Nginx Ingress controller, please do watch out for my next video where I'm planning to explain more on it. So that's all about today's video. Thank you.